Okay, I have lots of questions, but Akim, I think let me try to give you a chance before we go to the audience to respond to a little bit of what you heard. In part, what I heard was that Johanna was suggesting that there was a confusion about what your objectives were and whether the instruments lined up with the objectives. I think Jim's suggesting you're altogether not ambitious enough in realizing what you suggest that you want to realize. I'll just add one last wrinkle to this, which is there's a sense in which these two sides about inclusion and denial of deductions feels like you've created a problem and tried to solve it with two new instruments, which is you're doing income inclusion to solve a perceived problem, and then that creates a new problem, which is inversions and other kinds of problems. And so you go to denial of deductions to solve that problem. So in some sense, are you creating a problem and then trying to solve it with the other leg of it? But anyway, let me give you a chance to answer.
I don't even know where to start. And you definitely want to go home and not be here until Monday morning. Let me just make a couple of points. I think one, to understand the process and the status where we're at, right? We have 129 countries. This is not me sitting here saying like this is the solution to developing countries. There's actually developing countries in the room. In fact, we will be in a developing country if they still exist. And sometimes, you sort of wonder where the developing countries are, and I think we shouldn't probably even use the term. Some OECD members may be looking anyway, but that's a wider discussion. So let's ignore that. So this isn't a question where we sort of decide. This is something that we explore that's been agreed by 129 countries, including those. We actually have that very discussion with some of those countries concerned. And there are some countries that very legitimately make the point in their studies, including the IMF, we might debate whether that's solid or not solid, that suggest that some of those tax incentives result in tax reductions for multinationals, but little gain for developing countries. And developing countries in terms of domestic resource mobilization may be better off sometimes without some of these. It's a big question out there. I'm not saying that's the answer, which is why this document, I think that's what it should be doing at this stage, raises this question. It doesn't give the answer. And so you can always criticize a document that basically says, here's a bunch of questions that we need to think through as we go through this proposal. Some of the things that I've heard from Johanna here, in fact, are answered if you read the program of work. I think if you read the program of work and how does this relate to FHTP, then you read the language and it says, we will explore whether there could be carve-outs, and then the sentence continues and says very specifically, however, we recognize that this would undermine the efficiency of this proposal. So I think there's a message here probably. So if you go through this, some of the questions that we're asking here are answered to some degree, but at the same time, this isn't a paper that somebody in the Secretariat writes. This is sometimes that we work with the countries in the group. Now, in terms of have we created a problem with the inclusion rule that we now need to solve by the introduction of the undertax payment rule, to me, that's a misunderstanding of the proposal. The proposal didn't come out and say, oh, let's do an inclusion rule. Then we all went home, and on next Monday, somebody said, oh, that's stupid. Now we need something else, and then we added it. I think when the proposal was made consisting of two components. And I think there was a recognition in the design of the proposal that you needed those two components to have the two legs so that the proposal could walk. So I don't think there's a suggestion that people first said, oh, let's do an inclusion rule. Maybe the US could do an inclusion rule, and even they struggled with inversions, but certainly when you want to take this out, you kind of realize that there's an issue. If you are the sort of country that's worried about the inversions, which is not everybody, because the M&Es are pretty concentrated around the world. So, you have a difference here. So some of what you see in some of the discussion you see here is also the reality of tax policy making as we have it in the 21st century with the countries around the table. Now, there is many of these questions that we do need to answer. Those are all excellent questions, and these questions are the questions we're currently discussing. Pascal said we had the Working Party 6, we have Working Party 11, where the delegates from these 100 countries sit, and we work through some of these sessions. Like, how does this relate to tax competition? The vast majority of countries is very clear that there will be no carve-out for FHTP, right? But there's a question. Is there a question? If you look at, for instance, the US GILTI, the US GILTI has a carve-out for 10% on tangible assets. Is that something that's interesting? Is it not? That has its complexities, and we point out some of these complexities in terms of anti-avoidance, base stripping, interest, all the sort of stuff you have to do, or, does it affect the rate? And I think it's a sensible question to get there. Again, coming back to what it is trying to do, it is not trying to suggest that you have to have one corporate income system for the whole world, and Mongolia has to have the same system as the US. It raises the question which has been raised in the UK, it's been raised in many countries. Why do we not ensure through a system that every international business pays a minimum level of tax? And if it's something that we can see as an objective, then how can we sensibly get there? Certainly it raises this question also in light that the US guilty has done a step in this direction. So there's many of these elements that you see on which you build in the reality as this moves forward. When I sit here and can't give you necessarily the answer, like that would be the question when we have the proposal, which I'm sure we will have at the end of 2020, then you can sort of measure that it is. But at the moment, we are addressing these questions with all of them that are in this policy process. I just to understand where we are.
Fantastic. Before we open it up, I just want to put it back to Johanna and Jim. First off, I guess, Johanna, you suggested we should be sharpening what we have already as an alternative approach. Can you expand on what that means if you don't like what this is? And Jim, similarly, would you imagine a world where there are no minimum taxes, and is that the world you envision? Do you worry about the problems that you have seen here, or is yours? I know in part you were tongue in cheek about them not being ambitious enough, but I'm curious, where do you lie on that underlying question?
Well, first I would like to add one thing. I mean, E-Type said, well, there are deal breakers. So if we do not find a setting to really implement Pillar 1, then, I mean, we don't have to talk about it. And I mean, basically, Achim mentioned that whether we can rely on financial accounting, whether we have to find some benchmark rules. I mean, is that really realistic that we will not have a common tax base? But I mean, and this is basically the complexity of it. I don't know whether this is at all realistic for 129. I mean, you mentioned that so often. These 129 countries to come up with rules to apply the inclusion rule. I find it very difficult because, I mean, if we know all the complexity of applying CFC rules already that we have today on a very, I mean, much smaller scope. So I find that almost impossible to think that we can come with something like that. And now I come to my alternatives. Again, I mean, the question is, what do we actually want to achieve? And is it something that's somehow, I mean, Jim, of course, was much more sharp on that. I mean, some of these objectives not even seem to be reasonable. I mean, some of them may be very reasonable. I mean, going against tax havens, but then again, I would really want to ask, I mean, real tax havens where we do not have a shifting of active investment. Are we not able to somehow address them with the existing instruments we have already with CFC rules, if we really apply them? And also, it is in the working program, it is included. You say at one point, well, maybe we can implement that within the CFC rules. But I mean, again, is that it seems to be a quite new instrument. So I would really, I mean, it was, of course, in the public consultation, it was mentioned very often.
In some sense, it is a CFC rule on steroids.
Yeah,
so, there's existing technology. We're sharpening the tool, as you suggest.
But as you said, I mean, if you think of, I mean, applying CFC rules, even I mean, countries, maybe the US is able to do it, but even, I would say, sufficient tax administrations like in Germany, I think they have a hard time. I mean, it's more a deterrence rule. CFC rules at this moment are very much a deterrence rule and not something that you actually apply. So, but this sounds as if you want to apply it actually.
Mihir asked me about minimum tax. No, I would not have a minimum tax. I think a better system is source-basis taxation and allowing countries to choose the policies that they want, whatever they may be. And here's the thing. We're a room full of tax people, me included, of course, and we tend to think of the world in tax terms. But these countries are going to choose their infrastructure, their business regulation, their minimum wages, lots of other things, and without other countries telling them what to do. And you can, if you tell them what to do with taxes, all that's going to do is change what they do with other things. And I don't know that you necessarily want that. If you're going to allow countries sovereignty over all the other policies that they adopt that affect business, I don't see why you don't do it with taxes too.
Okay, that was lively. We have time. So we have time for a few questions. The gentleman right there.
Hi, Phil Greenfield from PwC. I think a number of the speakers have touched on elements of this, but I just want to narrow it down a little bit. I mean, some countries say no Pillar 1 without Pillar 2, and Atkins just said it's a package, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And it seems likely that we will get some elements of both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. But what does consensus look like in terms of Pillar 2? Does it mean you must adopt rules, but you don't have to? Do you have an element of you must have the rules, but then when you apply them, you can adopt really narrow rules, or you've got some element, as Joanna was saying, of administrative choice about whether you actually do it, notwithstanding any EU state aid rules, although you can get around those by having a directive. So,
Why don't we try to answer that one, and then we'll go to another one. Kim, do you want to?
Yes, we haven't talked about the EU implications. There's some significant EU law implications that take us further into the weekend. I think there's a couple of points, including also the point that Mike made in the morning. You know, many of the features of Pillar 2, unlike Pillar 1, could conceptually be done by domestic law. Right? You can do a CFC rule, you can agree that you do the same CFC rule, you can do something in Europe, and you can limit deductions subject to treaty compatibility and EU law again. So you don't necessarily need to go into treaty, but you will have to have, I think I agree, an effective mechanism that makes sure that, you know, if this is the principle you want to use, that there's something left on the table that, you know, first it needs to actually be left and then not everybody takes it. And so there's a question of how you coordinate that. So if you leave too much room and too many options, you may create a mess. So I think it would probably be better, but we need to see how the discussion goes, to be relatively specific on how this works, agree it in relative great detail of the mechanism of this, just so that you actually make sure that it only gets to the target, which will have to be refined to the policy discussion, including the question, are there some carve-outs, are there not? And, you know, the very important question of where do you put the rate, and the very important question that Johanna raises rightfully, many people that have tried to go into a common base have never returned from that exercise. So, you know, in terms of precedent, you know, good luck to us. Now, it's for a narrow purpose and it's much more focused. And, you know, there's a lot of attention to this and a lot of desire to make this work. But I think ideally, so where I sit here to answer the question, I think it should be something that's relatively crisp and tight in particular, so we avoid going anywhere further than what the target is, as it will be refined over the discussion.
Great. More questions? Itai.
So, very simple question.
One sec. Just get the microphone. Not that Itai is hard to hear, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you need a
use the
microphone.
Very simple question for Johanna and Achim. Did the European Court of Justice give us Pillar 2? In other words, you say, well, it's just a super CFC rule. Countries could do it by themselves. But of course, you have Cadbury-Schweppes and European Court of Justice jurisprudence. So maybe we have Pillar 2 only because Europe has an incoherent tax system. Query whether that's right. That's an American view.
Question for Johanna. Okay, kidding.
Well, I mean, this is of course a nice way to put the blame to the Europeans, but as we learned from the OECD, I mean, there's some paternalism for developing countries, so there are other reasons also. But I mean, of course, the European aspects we didn't go into them. I mean, I don't really agree, and I'm not sure whether the European Court of Justice will really stay with its so far CFC case law. So maybe because I mean, if you would implement this, and
CFC rule, that's how they'll get around the court of case law, right?
yeah, and so,
Well, I mean, you know, there's an evolving case law. I mean, this is not a seminar in European tax law, but you know.
But the implication of the question, I think, is, as far as I understood it, is somehow the Europeans get to have their cake and eat it too. You know, which is they get to propound these rules on other countries and then via their own devices circumvent them. Is that the thrust of it, Itai?
No. It's a kind of incoherent project, and the question is, why do we have it? And it's because we've been ignoring, all of Europe has been ignoring, that it has an incoherent tax court called the European Court of Justice for a very long time.
but now we harmonize our CFC legislation. So, for example, I mean, after ATAT, I do think that it will be more rigid.
Great. Other questions or issues? Mike Devereaux.
So, Jim, you said there's no economic theory saying we should have the same tax rates. So there's a paper by Dessau and Hines about capital ownership neutrality, which says, as I recall, two investors investing in the same country should face the same tax rate, so we don't get distortion who buys an asset. We could extend that, could we not, to saying we've got, suppose there's a British shoe manufacturer and an Italian shoe manufacturer both selling in Paris directly. Would we not want them to face the same tax rate so there's no distortion of competition there from a global efficiency perspective?
I'm glad you brought that paper up, Mike.
Yeah, everyone should read that
Tax
paper.
Journal.
Honestly, that paper does not say that all the tax rates should be the same everywhere. It says the relative tax rates. Yeah, I mean, Mike has a paper on the same topic, and so he knows that this was a slightly deceptive question. But look, countries differ in their tax rates. High tax places everywhere, high tax entities everywhere complain that low tax entities get a competitive advantage. And that's true not just across countries, but within countries. The for-profit sector complains about the non-profit sector, and so it goes. There are many cases in which the complaints are without foundation, in that take within country, say you have some taxed entities and some non-taxed entities. Does the non-taxed entity have a competitive advantage in providing goods? In many cases, no. It's true they're not taxed, but it's also true then their opportunity cost of capital is higher for the same reason. And I understand a lot of what drives the current movements is this fear that some are undertaxed and annoyance about that. And it may be that we need to do something about that. We probably do. But the question is, what exactly are the principles that we're trying to follow here? The same tax rate everywhere is not the right principle. It's not efficient. It puts a burden on some whose optimal tax rate is lower. And it puts burdens on others whose optimal tax rate is higher. Why would you do that? You would do it only because the worry is the alternative is chaos, and we have chaos right now. And I do understand the concern about chaos right now. But I don't want us to be confused into thinking that the same tax rates everywhere somehow is the efficient outcome, because it isn't, and theory never said it was.
Excellent. Any last questions? Yes, right there.
Hi, Francois Barres, Center for Business Taxation. I had a question for Jim. You raised the worry that if countries can't compete or don't compete over the corporate income tax rate anymore, they'll compete on other things. And I don't understand these worries. To me, it would be a great thing if they'll compete over, who got the best infrastructure system or the best education system, instead of competing on just a nominal rate.
And who had the lowest labor standards? You'd be good with that too? The lowest labor standards and lowest, abolished minimum wage, that you would like that too?
Well, it's unclear to what extent countries, for dictatorship, maybe, I reintroduce slavery in that square, right? For democracy, it's unclear whether that'll go through or whether people will be happy about it, right?
I'm not sure which of us is more naive. Look, countries are going to compete. And the question is, do we want to try to restrict one slice of that competition? And in order to understand whether you've made things better by doing that, you have to understand what happens to the other slices too.
Excellent. All right, that was fantastic. Thank you all. Oh, we have one last tiny question here before we go, just so we get our time back and we get our full allocation.
But very quick, I think always tend to hear there's a great obsession with corporate tax rates and how this drives business. And maybe in some areas it probably does. But let's not forget, let's say you sell 100 and your profit rate is 3 or 4%, and you're talking about 20% or 15% of that. We're talking about a tiny number. Most businesses are trying to focus on the 95% that's actually spent and trying to get value. That's what drives the decision for investment. The corporate tax rate, it's a nice headline, but let's not get too excited about it actually driving investment decisions from a business perspective.
Okay, I'm going to let that be the last word because we're already over time. So back to Mike. And thanks to all the panelists. Yeah.